When Astro first came out, it rightly got a lot of praise for being great with working with static content. However, it can do a lot more than that. Did you know that there are full dynamic endpoints available in Astro? Now, in the standard SSG mode, this means you can dynamically build static JSON files that you can then interact with. However, once you enable an SSR adapter, you get a lot more functionality. You get all the normal methods you would expect with fetch requests, like post and put and patch and delete. You can do all of this with server-side rendering and dynamic endpoints. On top of that, all this is always done server-side. That means everything is safe. You can even pass in environmental variables and make sure that they're protected because it's all run server-side. Now, in this video, I want to talk about 4 different things. We're going to talk about dynamically building static files, like an RSS feed. Secondly, we're going to talk about using dynamic endpoints to interact with content collections from a front-end UI framework like React. Third, we're going to talk about SSR mode with full CRUD operational capabilities. And finally, we'll look at even more dynamic possibilities with dynamic routing for endpoints. Now, this video will be more of a quick walkthrough of what's possible in Astro instead of a step-by-step guide. If you're interested in a more slow step-by-step process, check out my course at learnastro.dev. Right now, it's still in early access, so you can get a great deal on it, but I've got a whole module dedicated to dynamic endpoints. Okay, you ready to jump in? Let's go. Hey, what's up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. All right, let's go ahead and jump in, and the point of this video really isn't to detail how to do all this, it's to show you what's possible in Astro. So let's go ahead and start with looking at something in the public directory. If you'd like to look at the finished code, you're welcome to grab that link in the description. Here you can see I've got this data.json file, which is just a static file that lives in my public directory. Now, if you're not familiar with Astro, the public directory is not touched by Astro. It's simply put at the root of your site. So whenever I publish this, this would be at the root of my site /data.json. So in other words, it's just a static file. So of course I can go over here and I can just go to data.json and you can see it shows up right here as a static JSON file. Now this has very limited value to me. Anytime I want to update anything, I have to manually go update a data.json file. This is where dynamic endpoints come into play, because what I want is every time I build my site for any of my products to be updated live. Now you can see I've actually got a content collection. If you're not familiar with that, it's basically a type-safe way of writing markdown content. You can see here that I've got this content collection and it's just dumping in all these items and displaying them right here. Now, you may notice up top here that I'm saying it has to be in stock. So let's say I came over here and I went and grabbed one of those items, let's see, inside the products, like this headphone, and I changed this to false. Well, on my build, it'll actually remove that because it's no longer in stock. However, my data.json file is not updated. Obviously, it's just a static file. So what I want to do is create my own JSON file endpoint that I can get at any time that will always reflect the current status of my last build. Now, right now I'm in static site generation mode. There are 2 modes in Astro. One is SSR as well. We'll look at that in a moment, which will give you even more real-time data. At this point, however, in SSG mode, it's going to give me my data from my last build. Now, anytime you want to create a route in Astro, you have to do it in this pages directory. And by convention, I typically put mine inside of an API folder like this. And then we could do something like get products dot, and then we'll do JSON because that's the type of data we want to return. That will ensure the content type is passed properly. Now, I can use either TypeScript or I can use JavaScript. Doesn't really matter in this case. I'll just use TypeScript. And you can see here that what I've got is now a file that will eventually be built at getproducts.json. So the root of my site /API/getproducts.json. Now, if I jump over here to the endpoints documentation, you're going to see that I have to export a get function, and it has to be all caps like this. Now, if I want to, let's go ahead and grab this right here because this will give me the typing as well. There's actually a helper for TypeScript called API route from Astro. Control and spacebar will pull that in. Now, I'm getting some errors here because you have to actually send back a response. In static site generation mode, you can only do get requests. In other words, all I'm going to do is get the request when I hit this endpoint and return the data to me. It'll be, again, built statically to a static JSON file on my build. So in this case, what do I want? Well, I want to get my products. So let me come inside here, and we can actually copy a lot of the same logic that I have over here on my index page. So let's go ahead and grab this here, and we're just going to dump this right here, where I grab my products from my collection. So I'm going to go ahead and import this from get collection, and then I'll return all the data I have that's in stock. So speaking of returning that data, let's come back up here, and let's go ahead and return a new response. So let's go ahead and drop this in. And in this case, what I want to do is return the array of products. Now, as simple as that, now you'll see all my errors go away because I'm actually returning a new response. I can come back over this way and now just come over to API/getproducts.json. Now, there's all my products as JSON. Once again, in static site generation mode, the get method is the only one available because this will just build to a static file. So you can't do anything with this more dynamic than that. We'll look at the other methods available in SSR in just a moment. Now, I want to talk really briefly about what you're getting right here because we're not using it at all. Technically, it's just the context like this. So you're going to get a context back that will provide a bunch of details to you. And because this is server-side, everything in an API route is server-side, anything, as soon as I refresh over here, that's logged will be logged on the server logs. You can see that we've got a bunch of things here. The site, this actually comes from the Astro config, and I haven't defined that, which is why it's undefined, and then a bunch of other items here. Notice that what we were trying to grab at the moment was the params and the request. That's what we were returning to us, just destructuring those a moment ago. But I do have a couple other things in here as well. The URL being the only one that's really helpful when it comes to the static site generation mode. Again, the point of this in static site generation mode is just to get back static data. But now I know that this static data will always be live. That means if I come back over here and I change my headphones back to true, and I refresh over here, you'll notice we've got now all 3 products showing. So every time I build, it will actually update this live, and this endpoint will be created for me dynamically. Now, the other thing I want to ask is, why would this be helpful if I can just grab the content collections and any front matter of an Astro document like I've done over here? Well, you may occasionally be using something like React or some front-end UI framework that needs access to your content collections, but you don't have a way to get it to there. This is where this static file is really helpful. So let's go ahead and come over here. First of all, just to show you how this will work eventually, if I npm run build this, it will actually build my site and put it in a dist folder, just like it would be on a finished build. And notice if I come over here and I look at my dist folder, I've now got an API/getproducts.json. And it is just a static file, but it's a static file at the time of build that's up to date with my content collections. And that's essentially what we're wanting. We're wanting a static file that we can access. So back over this way, let's go ahead and add in React. And in Astro, you can do this with an npx command, Astro add, and then this is an official integration. I'll just add it as React. And just to see what it's doing here, the Astro CLI will, first of all, ask if it can install some packages, and I'll say yes. It will then want to update my config, and I'll say yes, and finally it'll update my TS config. I can come back in here and do npm run dev to get this back up and running. So what I want now is, since I know I'm going to have this available to me, I want to access this at this endpoint right here anytime I'm in my React file. So let's come back over this way and let's create a component. So I'm going to come inside here. We'll just create this as like React products. All right, I've just got something that will quickly scaffold this out. And here we're going to return all our products. Now you can do this in a couple of different ways. In this case, I'm not going to take in any data. All I'm going to do is have some state. And then we'll use effect to then grab that data when we need it. So let's go const. We'll call this products and set products. And we'll grab this from use state. And for now, let's just set it as an empty array. Now what I want to do is do a use effect, and let's make sure that our dependency array is empty. And then inside here, we're going to go ahead and create a function. That way we can do some async and await inside of here. So we'll just call this something like get products, and this will be an async function. And let's just go ahead and grab everything we need from our endpoint. So let's await a fetch to that endpoint. Now this should get us back our data. So let's go ahead and await this at res.json. And of course, you want to do some other things in here, likely a try catch and check to make sure the network request is okay and all that kind of stuff. But I'm going to keep this real simple to start with. And then finally, I just want to set my products to the data that I get back. So we've written this function. Let's call it now when this use effect fires. Okay, cool. So now we're going to return all the data down here. And let's just do a couple things. I've got Tailwind on here just to make it a little bit easier to style. Let's do grid and gap 6, something like that. And then inside here, what I want to do is first of all, check to make sure that the products.length is greater than 0. In other words, I'm waiting until that use effect fires, and then I'll actually display this down here. Now, assuming that's the case, we're just going to do the exact same logic we did on the home screen. So let's go ahead and come back over here. I'm just going to grab this right here because that's what we want to do over this way. So we'll do products.length. Once we have those, we'll now map over each of those items. We've obviously got a few changes we need to make, like this needs to be class name, and it doesn't know what type this is. Right now, I'm not going to worry about this, but it should all work properly. So we've got our basic little React component that is now able to grab our live data based on our last build. So let's go ahead and pull this in over this way. So I'm going to come down here. Let's go ahead and comment this out just so we don't confuse ourselves. And then I'll come inside here. We're just going to look for our React products. There it is right there. Let's go ahead and pull it in. Now you're going to notice something. If I come back over here, nothing is going to work. And that is because in Astro, by default, it doesn't ship any client-side JavaScript. Now you can use React to build out static HTML. In other words, if I were to come over here and inside this div, if I said something like hi or something like that, you'll notice it does actually build the static HTML. However, because this relies on JavaScript to actually fetch this and then return it and then display it, it's not going to do that unless I give that component the powers it needs. I can do that with a client directive. Now there are a bunch of possibilities here. All of them, with the exception of one, will render all the HTML and then merely just load in the JavaScript needed to interact with it later. However, in this case, what I want is I want the React component to control all of its own HTML and its own JavaScript. To do that, I need to use the client-only directive. This is the only one that'll do this, and I have to actually pass the name of the framework. So a little funky the way that this works, but essentially now what I'm doing is saying, hey, this component can not only control its own JavaScript, I also want it to control all of its own HTML. And just like that, it's actually loading from my dynamic endpoint and then inputting this content here. So I'm getting content collections down into a React component. So that's one use case for a dynamic endpoint in static site generation mode. Now, another really popular one is to use an RSS feed. So let me come up here and let's just search for RSS feed. There it is right there. And you'll notice that what it's doing is it's using this API endpoint and it's actually outputting an XML file. Look at this, rss.xml. Again, JS. Now, just like we did with our .json.ts file, you don't include the TS when you actually call it. This is just used to generate the actual file. And notice here it's using a get function. That's because the get method is the only one available in SSG mode. And all it's going to do is build a static file here at the base of my site or wherever it happens to be. In this case, they did it at rss.xml. That means you'll have a static RSS feed that's always up to date with your latest build. So that's another really good use case for static site generation mode with dynamic endpoints. But now let's go beyond just the static. Let's go to something dynamic. And you can do that with an SSR adapter. So let me move back over this way. Here, notice it calls these things API routes, true API routes, and that is because you can do any method available. So here you can see a get method. If I come down here, you'll see other ones like down here, we've got post and delete and even all, and then you can actually filter off the method itself. But the whole point here is that it's actually generating these responses live as somebody interacts with this route. That's how server-side rendering works, right? Now, again, in order to use this, you have to actually install some kind of an adapter. There are a bunch of adapters available. I'm just going to stick with the Node adapter, npx Astro add, and then we'll just use Node. There's one for Netlify and Vercel and a couple other platforms as well. Again, it will walk me through the steps to install everything and update my config. And then let's go ahead and get this thing up and running again with npm run dev. Now, if I come over here to my Astro config, you'll see that what it's added is an adapter right here, and it's set the output to server. Now, I've done a video on the past and the different modes available in Astro, so I won't go into the details here, but essentially you've got either static site generation mode, which is the default, or you've got SSR, which is what we've just installed right here. This output of server means every single page, every single route on our site will be dynamically generated when anybody hits it by the server. In other words, Astro will not build these as static files, it will instead build the functions needed to generate these static files when people hit our server. There's an in-between mode called hybrid. Hybrid will build everything statically, but on any individual route, you can set that individual route to build dynamically. So that's another option, and that's probably what I'll use here because typically I like to keep everything as static as possible and just essentially have things server-side rendered when they absolutely have to be. That way you kind of get the best of both worlds, the speed of the static files that don't have to change and the dynamicness of those files that might need to change. In this case, I'd obviously want these methods to be able to be used, so that file itself will need to be rendered dynamically. Okay, so with that said, let's go ahead and shut down some of this stuff. And I'm just going to come over here back to my API folder. Again, all the routing is done inside this pages directory. Here, what I'm going to do is just create a file called posts.json.ts. Now, I'm saying posts here because what we're going to do is use the JSON placeholder API. This is just a free fake API for testing and prototyping. So it's not actually going to do anything, but you can see that I can fetch certain endpoints and get back content, right? So if I run this script, you'll see I get back one post from, or one to do, I guess, here from the fake API. Now, there are a bunch of methods available to you. In fact, you can see you can do like get and post and patch and delete and all this kind of stuff. So let's go ahead and click on the guide to get a few of those items. So what I'm going to want to do is get all the resources. So let's come down here and we're going to hit this endpoint right here. Now, by creating my own little custom endpoint, what I can do is instead of hitting the JSON placeholder typecode API directly, I'll simply hit my API/post.json. And then if I do a GET request, I'll get back all the posts. If I do a POST request, I can add a new post, etc., etc. So let's go ahead and come over here. And instead of typing all this out manually like a cave person, I'm just going to grab all this right here. Let's not use the all, but I'll use the rest of these right here. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this in, and then let's come up here and do Control and Spacebar to pull in this helper for TypeScript from Astro. Again, what I want to do is whenever I hit this, I want to return back the data I need. So let's do the same thing we would have done a moment ago. Now, last time what I did is hit my content collections. In this case, what I want to do is do my own little fetch right here. And again, you'd probably want to wrap this in a try catch and do some more safety stuff, but just for ease of use and quickness here, I want to just await a fetch, and we just need to fetch that endpoint we found over here, right? So let's go ahead and dump this in right here, and then this needs to be in a sync function. That way I can actually await things inside of here. Now, once I get that back, we're just going to call this data. We'll do this from await res.json. And now for this right here, I'm not going to stringify a message. We're just going to have all the data show up right here. So this means if I hit this post.json, I should get back this right here if I do a GET request. So let's see how that works. So let's come back over here. We're going to get rid of this, close down this React component. We won't use that anymore, and come inside here. Now, I want to mimic the same structure we have here, but let's first of all talk about where we might run this fetch itself. Because I can fetch this post.json endpoint in a couple of different places. In Astro, this front matter up here is always only ever server side. So I simply could do the fetch directly here, but in that case, what I could do is just fetch it like this, right? And then I could just return the data itself and loop through it myself. So I can do it just like this, and I can do top level await right here. That means I could take the data, and if I came down this way, let's go ahead and copy this down. And here we're just going to take the data and loop through each of the items. So we'll call this post, and looking over here at the way it's typed, I've got post, and then something like title, and maybe we'll just include one more thing, which would be like the user ID. That would just be post.user ID. If I do that and come back over this way, you'll see now I'm getting all these back, right? So I could do all this in the server-side code myself. I don't have to have an API endpoint for that. Sometimes it's helpful, though, to contain all the logic for some kind of fetch in one area. So for instance, I might have multiple pages that are going to display posts, and rather than have this in each of those top-level pages that I then have to go tweak if I want to make any changes, I can have a single route that controls all that logic. So that means all I'd have to do over here is simply replace this with my API post.json. Now, this is not going to work if I hit save. And the reason this is not going to work is because you have to provide a full URL here. So what I would need to do is instead provide my full URL for my site. Now, because I'll be in dev mode and I'll be in production mode, I can just have astro.url. So in dev mode, that'll be localhost 4321, and in production, it will be whatever my base site is. And now you can see it works the exact same way, except I've got a little wrapper around this API. So if I want to make any changes to how this is displayed, like filtering it or anything like that, I can do it all in one place. Now, unlike in static site generation mode, you can actually pass along a bunch of different things here. So once again, you can see it's destructuring the params and the request, but I could just come in here and grab the context like this, and then let's just console log this as well. So if I come over here and let's refresh, let's see, we need to go to the actual endpoint. This would be post.json. All right, there we go. So I get all those posts back, but you'll see that I get a bunch of other things in addition to what I got earlier. But what you'll see is I get access to a lot of the stuff we saw earlier. But because this is dynamic, I can do certain things like, for instance, pick off a certain search param. Now let's think about the other methods available to us. And in order to do that, I prepared something ahead of time where we just got a custom form that we can embed. So let me come back over here to my index and let's get rid of all this. Rather than fetching this right here, what we're going to do is just have a form. So I'll look for my custom form and just import it right there. Now, if I come back to the home page over here, you'll notice that now I've got this product, this ID, this author ID, and this post content. So this would obviously be client-side JavaScript. And if I command and click, I can open up this right here. Here's the form itself. Very simple. Now what I want to do is actually grab this form and on submit to do something with it. And that would be to do a post endpoint to, again, my custom endpoint, which will then hit this API. So let's give this something like add post or something as an ID. And I'll jump down this way and do some client-side JavaScript. Now in Astro, you can do client-side JavaScript. You have to just explicitly put it in the body of the document here in script tags or reference a file from these script tags. So here we'll do like new post form equals document.querySelector, and we'll simply just have our add post. Now whenever this new post form is submitted, we'll just do an add event listener for submit. And here we just want to e.prevent default first of all. And then let's go ahead and grab all the content from this form. Now you'll notice here that I've got all these inputs and they all have names associated with them. I did that intentionally so we could use the JavaScript API to interact with form data. So we'll just call this our form data. We'll grab this from new, form data, and then we'll pass it the form itself. Now this will give us back all the submitted items in this form data API. Now just to make TypeScript happy, let's have this as an HTML form element. Now it's a little funky the way this thing works, but in order to abstract these out as some kind of object, I'm just going to do values or something like that. We'll do object.fromEntries, and then I'll pass it the form data that I get back. Again, this is just normal JavaScript stuff, but if you're not familiar with the form data API, it can be a little funky at first. Now what I'm going to do is get all these back when I enter them in. So let's just have something here, and that should work just like that. Now this is all client side, so it'll show down this way. You'll notice that that's exactly what it does, and I get all of them back as an object. Okay, so now I know the data I'm getting. Now I want to hit my custom endpoint. Now there's a couple reasons why you might want to create this right here. In this case, this is an unauthenticated request right here. So I'm going to do a post request from here to this JSON placeholder endpoint, and it could of course be unauthenticated. I could do this client side. It wouldn't matter because there's no kind of special thing I'm passing along here. However, because this route is server-side, I can actually do like protected server-side things, like use API keys and stuff like that. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're using a hybrid mode, which means if I want to use this post request, jumped around here. What I need to do is come into the top of this file right here and export a const called pre-render, and I need to set this to false. Now, if I was just using the normal server-side mode where everything is server-side rendered, I wouldn't have to do this, but I want everything else to be statically rendered except for this individual route. That means now I've got dynamic possibilities right here. So what I want to do is grab this fetch right here because we're going to create a resource on post. But first of all, I need to actually get my data from the request itself. So let's grab this from the request.json. That will be the data we actually get back. And I do need to await this, which means I need to come up here and do an async here. So this should just give me all the data that I pass on to this post route. Then what I can do is simply use this fetch right here. So let's do const, let's just call it res again. We'll just await this whole fetch. Now, in this case, what I want to do is obviously pass on my custom data here instead. So I'm just going to grab my data and drop it in directly here, and then I'll get this back from the JSON placeholder. Now, this is creating a fake resource. Obviously, it's not really changing their data. You can see that down here, but it should give me back something like this. So let's go ahead and capture that. And again, you would do this in some kind of try-catch, but let's just grab this as like return or something like that. But let's just call this something like output, and this will be from await res.json. So I should get an output that looks just like this. What I can do then is on this message, just say like if output.id, then we'll just say success. Otherwise, we'll say failure. And obviously, there are way more robust ways to do this, but the point is that we're posting somewhere and actually able to interact with this. Now, in this case, we obviously don't have any kind of authentication, but let's say we did. We just had something like authentication, and we had to pass on some kind of bearer token. So here I could do like bearer and then pass on some token. Now, this is typically done by storing this data in an .env file. So let's come over here. We'll do .env. And let's say I have some kind of like API token, and it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, something like that. Now, by default, Astro protects this, so it's only available in server-side code. If you ever want something to be available client-side, you have to actually prefix it with public and then whatever it happens to be. So in this case, you can see I want this just to be server-side accessible, so I should be able to come over here and just access this, let's see, inside of my API route, which was right here. Now, this is using Vite under the hood, so the way you import this is by using import.meta.env and then the name of whatever it happens to be. This is API token like this. Now, let's actually make sure we're getting this properly. Maybe we should bring it up here anyhow. We'll say like something like key equals all this, and then let's just console log this to make sure it's actually working. And this is server side, so obviously we would only see this on the server when we actually hit this endpoint. So let's go ahead and hook up our form to the endpoint so we can actually see that this is working properly, and you could pass along things like these env variables safely from the server. So now that I've got my actual values I need, I can go ahead and await a fetch to that endpoint. So let's come up here. We'll just need to make sure this is an async function. And then let's just go ahead and do the same thing where we're going to res await a fetch. In this case, we can just do /API/posts.json. Now, I do need to actually pass along a method to make sure that it doesn't hit my get endpoint, but instead my post endpoint. So this is just post. And with post, I have to actually pass on a body as well. And this, we're just going to JSON stringify the actual values. So if we did all that correctly, we should actually get a response back. What's our response going to be? Well, we know it's going to have a message property of either success or failure. So let's go ahead and capture that. And that's back over this way. So let's just destructure the message from whatever response we get back. So this would be awaiting the res.json. And then finally, let's console log this. So this will actually be client side over here. So let's open up those logs right over here. Whenever we hit submit, it should get us back either success or failure. And then we're also going to want to look at to make sure .env variable got pulled in as well. So I'll have some kind of title, I'll have an author ID, and then we'll have some kind of post content. And when I submit this, we should get 2 logs. One over here that says success, and one over here that gives me my key. So both of those are working properly. So cool. So we're getting everything to work just as we expect. So server-side rendering opens up a bunch of new possibilities because now this is being dynamically hit and then generated by that code on the server. Obviously, instead of just passing in it twice here, let's go ahead and just use my key that I grabbed up top. Okay, so this would be how to do a post route. Now with the delete route, we can do a couple of different things. We could pass on, for instance, like a query param on each of those requests. However, Astro gives us the opportunity to do something even more dynamic. So let's come up top here. You'll notice that we can actually have params and dynamic routing. So just like you can use Astro, you can use these bracketed syntax to create a dynamic route that is then generated either live with server-side rendering or is statically built ahead of time, but at each of these individual routes with this bracketed syntax, you can do the same thing for API routes. So let's go ahead and do that for the delete opportunity right here. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out, and let's come over here. And here I'm actually going to create a new folder. We'll just call this posts. And inside the post, here we're going to have just this bracketed syntax where we have some kind of ID that we pass along, .json.ts. And then I'm just going to paste back in this delete function and pull in that API route helper. Now what Astro will do is it will look at API/posts/ / whatever ID I happen to pass in. This would be my params that I passed in. Now notice right here, I could just pick this directly off the params that I get as part of the context. Now because I named the file ID, I need to pull in the ID from the params, and that's what I need to name it as well. Now if I jump back over to the JSON placeholder API, you can notice that if I want to delete a resource down here, all I have to do is pass it this with a method of delete. So let's come inside here. We're just going to async this right here so that I can await this fetch, right? And here I don't want to pass along this hard-coded. Instead, I want this to be the ID that I passed in. Now, you'll notice that I should get back some kind of response. So let's go ahead and console log this. So we'll say data equals await res.json. And then for the message, let's go ahead right here. We'll just pass along the message as the data right here. Now, this means I can hit this dynamic endpoint with whatever ID I happen to have, and I think it's 1 through 100 on these resources, and it will delete those and then return back this response to me. So how are we going to use this? Well, let's come back over this way, and once again, I'm going to cut out the custom form. And here I want to loop through the data that we're getting back from our get endpoint, but I want to add one more thing here. I'm going to add a button on each of these, and let's just put a data property of ID on here, or we'll have the post.id. Again, this is all connected to the actual JSON placeholder API, and here let's do a couple of other things. So because this is just going to have an icon in here, we'll do an ARIA label, or we'll say like delete post or something like that. And then here I'm just going to go ahead and grab an icon from Iconify. We'll just look for like a delete or trash or something like that. There we go. Pop this thing in here. That's just an extension that comes with Raycast that allows you to paste in SVGs. And then just because I know this won't look great and I can't help myself, let's go ahead and do a grid, place items center, and like a padding 2 or something like that, just using Tailwind. Okay, so if I come back over this way, you'll notice, oh boy, we should probably come down here and also add a class where we do like size 4 or something like that. Okay, there we go. So not the prettiest things in the world, but now you can see I've actually got real delete buttons right here that I can click, and I should be able to delete these and hit my custom endpoint. So what we need to do now is grab anything that has a data ID and then loop through this on the client. So let's go ahead and have a script tag here where we grab like delete buttons, and this will just be document.querySelectorAll. We'll just grab anything with a data ID property on it. Now let's go ahead and grab those delete buttons, and we're just going to attach an event listener to each of them. So for each, we'll just do button.addEventListener. We're going to listen for a click. And when that is clicked, all we want to do is hit our custom delete endpoint, right? Now, the first thing I need to do is to pick off that data ID property, right? I need to know the number of the actual post. So we could do something like post ID, and this would just be the button. So I guess we don't even need the event right here. This would just be the button.dataset.id. Now, TypeScript is yelling at me here because it doesn't know what type this is. So let's go ahead and come up here, and we're just going to type this as a node list of, and then we'll just do HTML button element. All right, so now I know that these are button elements, which means they can have data sets on them like this. So now all we need to do is use this to hit our dynamic endpoint. Now remember where that was situated. It's under API, posts, and then whatever the ID happens to be. That means we can just fetch that directly here. So let's call this res, and then we'll do await, fetch, and here this will be dynamic. It'll be API, posts, and then whatever that ID happens to be, right? What do we call that? Post ID? And then because it's a delete endpoint, there's one other thing I need to pass along, which is a method of delete. Now, in order to await, I have to obviously come up here and make this an async function. And then I should get back some kind of response. Remember, this will have a message property on here. At least I think that's the way we set it up, right? Yeah, the message with the data, whatever that happens to be. This will be from my res, which I need to await.json. And then just to make sure I know what's going on here, let's go ahead and console log this as well. So let's talk through that real quickly just to make sure we understand what's going on. I've created these buttons that when I click them, it will then fire this event. The event will then hit this dynamic endpoint, which will then delete this custom response. Now, the real benefit here is if I had some kind of API key I had to pass along with this, I could do all this safely on the server and just on the front side, hit this with whatever fetch I needed. In this case, a delete fetch. Hit this with whatever fetch I needed. In this case, it'd be a method of delete. So if we did all this correctly, which is slightly doubtful, what I can do is come over here and click right here, and we get an error. Now, can you think of why that might have happened? Remember, we have the entire site statically generated, except for routes that we've explicitly marked as being dynamic. So if I come over here, you might remember under this get products, or what was it, posts right here, we made this one not pre-render. I've not yet done that over here, which means when I try to hit this with anything other than just a get request, it's going to fail. Now there's actually one more bug in the code that we haven't fixed, and that is I need to end this with .json because that's the name of the file itself. Now, hopefully this will work if I click delete. There we go. I actually get back some kind of message, which tells me something happened. Maybe just to make sure that it's actually hitting this, let's come down here, and I'm just going to pass in the ID instead of the data, just to make sure I'm actually getting back something on the front end. So whatever ID this happens to be, if I click it, it should tell me, oh, it's ID 1. This one should be ID 2, etc., because it's just listing these posts out in order. Now, we could, of course, do the exact same thing with some kind of put or patch request as well and create our own dynamic endpoint here as well. But hopefully this has given you a really good overview of all the things available to you with these dynamic endpoints, whether it's just statically getting content back, maybe from your content collections and using that in some kind of front-end UI framework, or doing something truly dynamic like setting up SSR and then having all the different methods available to you. You can even protect your environmental variables to only be used on the server, and then safely do all these fetches yourself to whatever custom endpoint you have, your database or whatever else you're interacting with. And on top of just having different methods available to you, you also have these truly dynamic routes that can take in any kind of ID or whatever your param happens to be, and then hit some kind of custom endpoint based on that ID. This means you get full CRUD operation using Astro and server-side rendering. Well, we covered a lot. Like I said, it was more of a quick walkthrough and less of a step-by-step guide, but I still hope it was helpful for you and you got a sense of how you can use Astro's dynamic endpoints in both SSG and SSR mode. Now, if you're interested more in Astro, check out my course. There's a link in the description at learnastro.dev. I'd love to see you over there. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Happy coding.